Hello, today's presentation is called My Child's School is Taking Disciplinary Action. What should I know? Disciplinary action in this context refers to a student being removed from school, suspended from school, or expelled. An important disclaimer before we begin. We are not giving legal advice, and we are not representing anyone throughout this presentation. My name is Brittany Harris, and I am a law clerk with the Education Advocacy Team this summer. I'm a law student at Loyola University Chicago, entering my second year. At Loyola, I am pursuing a dual degree in law and education policy studies. Today, I will be speaking specifically about rights of students and parents surrounding suspension from school. Additionally, we want to note that this year, the Moran Center is celebrating 40 years in service within the community. And to kick off this special event, we especially want to welcome all students and families as they return back to school. So a little bit about the Moran Center. The Moran Center is a non-for-profit organization in Evanston that focuses on three things: justice in the classroom, justice in the courtroom, access to the classroom, and support in the community. The Moran Center seeks to provide Evanston youth and families with the support to successfully emerge from a challenging legal situation, tools to make positive life choices, and the ability to thrive in the Evanston community. Specifically, the Education Advocacy Team represents students in District 65 and District 202. We represent families and students on cases ranging from accessibility to special education services to issues surrounding disciplinary practices. Our ability to represent clients is based on financial criteria as well as residents within the city of Evanston. A little bit more about the team. The team is comprised of Luca Guacci, who is the managing attorney, Sarah Fruden, who is the assistant education attorney, Andy Freilich, who is our Equal Justice Works Fellow, and a team of law clerks who worked together over the summer. So it's important to first be aware of disproportionality in student discipline and the trends in data that prove these discrepancies. Students experience disciplinary practices such as suspension from school at disproportionate rates. Exclusion from the classroom is a form of discipline around which you and your child have rights. There are both racial and gender disparities that are important to be aware of, in addition to disparities among students with disabilities. Based on research conducted by a 2020 U.S. News report, white students lost 21 days per 100 students enrolled in instruction due to out-of-school suspensions, or OSS. Comparatively, Black students lost 103 days. Essentially, this means that a Black student lost 5 times the number of school days than their white peers did. This is an incredible discrepancy that should be considered when exploring the role that racism plays in disciplinary practices, especially when considering the fact that the majority of staff and teachers are white. According to a U.S. Department of Education study, 79% of teachers were found to be white. The average teacher, specifically a 43-year-old woman. When looking at disproportionate numbers of students of color suspended, this important dichotomy must be critically considered. According to Public Act 100, specifically pertaining to the state of Illinois, African American girls represent 54% of female children receiving one or more out-of-school suspension, but only 20% of female preschool enrollment overall. What this means is that while in a classroom, there are only one Black female student for every 5 students, 1 in 2 of these students are likely to be suspended. Similarly, despite the fact that Black boys make up only 20% of preschool enrollment, they represent half of preschoolers who are suspended more than once. And finally, Black and Latino boys represent less than half the boys of all boys in preschool. Though this demographic of students has a 1 in 2 chance of being suspended in preschool, meaning that the likelihood of a Black or Latino male being suspended is disproportionately higher than their white male peers. So specifically in Illinois, as discussed in a webinar conducted by Franzik, which is a mid-sized firm located in Chicago that specializes in education law and specifically represents school districts within the state of Illinois. Data from the 2017-2018 school year shows that while Black students make up only 15% of overall student enrollment, this demographic of student represented almost 40% of students who were suspended at least once, and 36% of all students expelled. In comparison, white students accounted for 47% of student enrollment, a much higher percentage than Black students, but the same percentage of students expelled. Again, what this data suggests is that despite the fact that Black students are the minority of total students enrolled in Illinois, a shocking 1/3 of Black students are likely to be suspended not only once, but multiple times. Again, this incredible discrepancy in Illinois must be critically considered when looking at disciplinary practices. This visual represents the disparities in school suspension, specifically broken down by race and ethnicity, taken from the Department of Ed, or the Office of Civil Rights, OCR. Looking at the three graphs, we see here on the left, this is total enrollment. So we matching up the colors here. Oops, excuse me. We see that 47%, or almost half of the students, are white. 38% of these students are suspended once or more than once, and 32%, so that's in school, and then the third is out of school. So 32% are suspended once or more than once out of school. Comparatively, and this is the important part, looking at the total enrollment of Black students, we see that 15% of students are Black. Going to the middle graph, we see that double that number, 30%. One or more in-school suspensions. Looking to our final graph, we see that 38%, so almost 40% of Black students represent students who are suspended once or more than once out of school. Looking at another visual, when it comes to disparities in suspension numbers, there's also an important intersection between race and disability. So as this chart demonstrates, based on evidence collected by the UCLA Civil Rights Project, the likelihood of being suspended as a white student is 1 in 20, while the likelihood of being suspended as a Black student is 1 in 6. This number dramatically increases even more when looking at data surrounding Black students who have a disability. These students have a 25% chance of being suspended. Putting this into perspective, while white students have a 1 in 20 chance, a slight 5% chance of being suspended, a Black student with a disability has 5 times the likelihood of being suspended at least once. This graph not only demonstrates disproportionate rates in student discipline when it comes to race, but also when a student has a disability. Students with disabilities, especially students of color, face disproportionate rates of suspension compared to their peers. So these disparities in student discipline have been researched and reported, and as a result of these disproportionate numbers, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or we'll see that again, OCR, published a notice of request for information regarding the non-discriminatory administration of school discipline. So that's the name of the report. This report covered the disparities and exclusionary discipline practices that exist for students based on race, color, national origin, gender, and disability. OCR published this report and then a request for information on school discipline based on the disparate impact on students. In response to this request, OCR hopes to hear from stakeholders, including parents, teachers, students themselves, about how the department can support students and eliminate discrimination in schools. Comments from the public were due this past summer on July 23rd. Let's continue to keep an eye out for what OCR will do based on these public comments. When it comes to disciplinary practices, specifically in Illinois and specifically regarding suspension, you and your child have rights. Let's begin with a few general statements to test your knowledge. True or false? Schools can send a child home without any written documentation if the behavioral issue is severe. I'll pause for a few seconds to think about the answer to this one. That answer is false. Any suspension from school shall be reported immediately to the parent or guardian of a pupil, along with a full statement of the reasons for such suspension and the notice of their right to review. This is word for word from Illinois Compiled Statute 105, 5/10 through 22.6, Section B. Parents must be given immediate notice when their child is suspended. Additionally, the school board must be given notice as well. This notice must include the reason for the suspension in addition to the length of the suspension. Parents then have the right to request a review of this suspension, which involves either the school board or an appointed hearing officer to review the conditions surrounding the suspension. At this review, parents are permitted to meet with these individuals, whether it's the school board or the hearing officer, to discuss the circumstances. Again, the important takeaways here, the reason for the suspension must include the length of time as well. Moving on to our second statement. True or false? A school can suspend any student for as long as they wish based on the violation of the school's code of conduct. Again, think about this statement for a few seconds before we go into the answer here. Answer is false. According to Illinois Compiled Statute 105/10 through 22.6, a suspension is not to exceed 10 days. An important stipulation is if a student is suspended due to, quote, gross disobedience or misconduct on a school bus. In this case, the board may suspend the student for more than 10 days for safety reasons. Additionally, out-of-school suspensions, or OSS, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, of 3 days or less, excuse me, may be used only if the student's continuing presence in the school would pose a threat to school safety or disruption to other students' learning opportunities. This shall be determined on a case-by-case basis by the school board or its designee. School officials must make all reasonable efforts to resolve these threats, address disruptions, and minimize the length of in-school suspensions to the greatest extent possible. Another important point includes what we call exceptional cases, which permit a student to be removed from school up to 45 days, regardless of whether a student has a disability or not. So there are 3 circumstances that this would be permissible. The first is if a student uses a gun, knife, or other threatening weapon in the incident. So if one of those 3, gun, knife, or threatening weapon is involved in the incident, that would include a exceptional circumstance. 2, illegal drugs are used, possessed, or sold. That would be another reason to suspend a child for up to 45 days. And then the third is if the student inflicts grave bodily harm on another student on school premises or at a school-sponsored event. So again, those are exceptional cases which permit a school to suspend a student for up to 45 days. So continuing on, for students with disabilities, there are additional safeguards put into place that ensure that these students' needs are met. First, should a student be suspended for a period of time that is longer than 10 days, they must receive the educational services that they are entitled to on each of these additional days. Next, as the slide reads, if the suspension is to exceed 10 days, A meeting called a manifestation determination review must be held. So we'll talk about that shortly. But again, I just want to make note that the 3 exceptional cases explored previously permit the school to exceed this number of permitted days, even if the student has a disability. So breaking for a moment, I talked about a manifestation determination review, or an MFR. So what this is it's a meeting to determine whether the student's disability was the reason for the incident leading to the suspension. In other words, an MFR is a meeting to consider the involvement of a child's disability in their suspension from school. So it involves the parents and the members of the IEP team, and it occurs when removal of a student with a disability from school exceeds 10 days. And at this meeting, there are 2 essential questions that must be asked. The first, was the conduct caused by, or did it have a direct and substantial relationship to, the student's disability? So that's the first one. Was the conduct caused by, or did it have a direct and substantial relationship to, the student's disability? And the second is, was the conduct a direct result of the school district's failure to implement the IEP? Just to review, an IEP is an individualized education plan that students received with accommodations based on their learning needs. So again, that second one is, was the conduct the direct result of the school district's failure to implement the IEP? If the answer to either of these questions is yes, then no further disciplinary action can be taken that exceeds the 10-day removal from school. So if either answer is yes, then the student cannot be suspended for more than those 10 days. So that's why it's important to conduct an MFR, or manifestation determination review. All right, moving on to our next statement. True or false? Students with disabilities can receive the same punishments as students without disabilities. Again, take a second to think about this one. That answer is true. A student with a disability can receive the same punishments as other students, with the exception that a student with a disability has some additional protections if they are suspended for more than 10 days in a total school year. So that being said, students with disabilities cannot be disciplined in a harsher manner than students without disabilities. I'll say that again. Students with disabilities cannot be disciplined in a harsher manner than students without disabilities. Disciplinary practices should be standard, and there cannot be varying punishments for the same infraction based on the student. However, it's important to note that school safety trumps special education laws, and the school does have the right to call the police without a parent's consent when a safety issue is involved. My child got suspended. What can I do? So now that we've kind of warmed up with some important rights you have surrounding suspension, what happens if your child does get suspended? Well, here are the following steps that you should make note of if you ever become aware of your child's suspension. First, keep track of all documentation. That includes emails, letters from the school, and especially the letter notifying you of your child's suspension. That's going to be really important, especially because those 2 things we need to see: the reason and the duration for the suspension. Next, keep track of the number of days your child is out of school. In a row, in a school year, keep track of this number. Third, request a manifestation determination review, or an MDR, if your child is suspended for more than 10 days in a row or over the course of the school year, and if your child receives special education services. And then finally, request a behavior intervention plan, or a BIP, based on a behavior evaluation. And we'll talk about that shortly. So additionally, if the child is considering expelling your student or your child, make sure that you are aware of your rights. Expulsion and information surrounding expulsion will be covered on the upcoming slides. So we just talked about what's called a BIP, or a behavioral intervention plan. So it's developed, this plan is developed after an assessment is taken. So essentially there's two major acronyms here. There's an FBA and a BIP. An FBA stands for the Functional Behavior Assessment. So that's like the test that's taken. And then the BIP, the Behavior Intervention Plan, is the plan that comes from the test. Okay, so you're going to see those two acronyms that kind of go hand in hand. So an FBA is an assessment that helps develop an understanding of a child's behavior. And then based on the findings of an FBA, a BIP is then developed. Parents have the right to request an FBA in an effort to develop a BIP. And the goal of a BIP is to avoid punitive disciplinary practices such as suspension. And the effort is to provide a better understanding of what the student's exact needs are. So this is what the school can do, and it's something to consider, especially when behavior issues are involved. So a BIP has to include the following information. It has to include the summary of the FBA. So it has to include the summary of the assessment itself. It needs to include an explanation of the interventions that were previously used to address the student's behavior. It needs to include student strengths. It needs to include specific behavior that should be taught to replace the previous behavior. And then it should also include a list of supports and services that will help aid the student. We're going to look at the next slide. The next slides cover an example of what an FBA looks like and what a BIP looks like. So here's an example of an FBA. This is a functional behavior assessment, and we've blocked out the names here to respect privacy. But essentially, it's just important to see there are a number of different, it's kind of like a flow chart, a number of different areas to look at. There's desired behavior, there's the problem, there's the trigger, what leads to this problem, what's being observed, alternate behaviors that should be taught, student strengths. So all of these different areas are taken during this assessment and then recorded. And then this is an example of a BIP. So again, we've blacked out the names in order to maintain privacy. And this BIP was created based on the FBA, and it provides a behavior plan for students based on the observed behavior. So again, we've got what's called setting event strategies, antecedent strategies, behaviors, teaching strategies. So this would be in the classroom, and then consequence strategies. So the hypothesis statement here is kind of like the guiding statement. It's like the umbrella statement. So when this student is given an academic task that this student perceives as too difficult or is redirected to follow classroom expectations, this student engages in off-task behaviors, such as talking with peers, shutting down, getting out of their seat, etc. So essentially, this is like what the issue is that's being observed, and then below is strategies to address this. So again, this is just a little bit more information here. We've got the implementation period, so how long this would last, and then scheduled interviews to measure effectiveness. That means every 6 weeks, there will be an assessment looking at how the child is doing based on this BIP. Okay, so suspensions in Illinois specifically, here are additional facts to be aware of. When a child is suspended, it's important to be aware of the following. First, like we've previously talked about, the school board must be given a summary of the notice, which includes the reason of the suspension as well as the length of the suspension. Again, parents have the right to review their suspension with the school board and/or the hearing officer. So you always have the right to review the conditions surrounding the suspension with those the school board or with that appointed hearing officer. And schools have the responsibility to limit school suspensions as much as possible, and they can only be used for legitimate educational purposes. Moreover, it's important to be aware of the difference between a suspension and expulsion, in addition to the distinctions between in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions. These are defined on the following slides. So according to ISB, which is the Illinois State Board of Education, a suspension is removal from all school programs by administrative action for gross disobedience or misconduct. Essentially, this means that a suspension occurs whenever a student is removed from a school program. Suspensions are defined more specifically based on whether the suspension is an in-school suspension or an out-of-school suspension. More information on these distinctions follow on the next slide. Expulsion is a more severe form of punishment and is defined as an action taken by the local education agency removing a student from their regular school for disciplinary purposes for the remainder of the school year or longer in accordance with local educational agency policy and Illinois compiled statute 5/10 through 22.6. When students are expelled from school, there are rights that both parents and students have, such as a disciplinary hearing with members of the school board or with an appointed hearing officer. So again, expulsion is going to be that more severe form, and that removal is for the duration of the school year or potentially longer. Now looking at in-school suspensions, ISS, versus out-of-school suspensions, OSS. So ISB, Illinois State Board of Education, defines the difference between ISS and OSS. ISS includes instances in which a child is temporarily removed from their regular classroom for disciplinary purposes, but remains under the direct supervision of school personnel. According to ISB, direct supervision means school personnel are physically in the same location as the students under their supervision. Okay, so that's the important part, so that these students are still under school supervision here. OSS involves instances in which a child is temporarily removed from their regular school for disciplinary purposes to another setting, either home or a behavioral center. And it includes removals when IEP services are provided because the removal is 10 days or less, as well as removals in which the child continue to receive services according to the student's IEP. So essentially the difference here, out of school suspension is just what it sounds like, right? It's when students are suspended off the school premises, and those are more severe. So in school suspensions, what do I need to know? ISS occur when a student is suspended without leaving school premises. If your child does not receive educational services, this counts towards the 10-day suspension rule. So what you can do, request a letter from the school reporting on the behavioral incident. So get more information. Request a letter from the school specifying education services that your child will or will not be receiving. You want to know what services that the school is going to be providing during the suspension period. And then finally, request a letter from the school regarding special education services that your child will or will not be receiving. Specifically, if your child has an IEP, you want to know what IEP services are being provided during this time. Out of school suspensions, what do you need to know? OSS, as I previously said, are a serious disciplinary practice and should only be used for legitimate educational purposes. ISB recommends that schools first consider non-exclusionary disciplinary practices before using out-of-school suspensions. Additionally, schools are not permitted to follow what's called zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance means that a school is not permitted to require an out-of-school suspension or expulsion for a specific behavior. Putting that into like an example, a school cannot impose a rule. I'm making this rule up. If a student smokes marijuana in the bathroom, then that student receives an out-of-school suspension for 3 school days. That's what's called zero tolerance, and schools are no longer permitted to follow practices that have such harsh rules like that. They must be considered on a case-by-case basis. Additionally, any out-of-school suspension that lasts longer than 3 days can only be permitted if all other solutions to that behavior have been attempted and if the student's behavior seriously threatens members of the school community. Again, the school is required and is responsible for looking to alternatives before removing a child from school. So final rights surrounding suspensions. Again, as we just talked about, schools are never allowed to use zero tolerance policies. If your child is suspended, act right away and take the necessary steps covered in this presentation. You have the right to the reason and duration surrounding your child's suspension. So you need to be notified of the reason and the length of the child's suspension. Again, as we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, disciplinary practices are disproportionate in nature. We see that in the data and the research. If you believe that an injustice has occurred, tell someone at the school or consider getting representation. And then finally, students with disabilities have additional safeguards that schools must follow when implementing disciplinary practices. So, who can you call if you believe that your child has been suspended in a way that violates their rights? Call the Education Advocacy Program at the Moran Center. So the number is provided here. So 847-492-1410. And then a member of the Education Advocacy team specifically will take your call. Explain that you have an education issue with your child and that you would like to do what's called an intake. From here, a member of the team will complete an intake form, which is just a way for us to gather information about your child and what happened. If your family does not meet our financial criteria, then we will still be able to provide referrals to other services. So again, feel free to write that number down, 847-492-1410, and then you want to speak with a member of the Education Advocacy team. Additional resources that you can be aware of, or you should be aware of, include Equip for Equality, which is another non-for-profit, and they have a website offering an incredible amount of resources, including an interactive discipline training module that walks through rights surrounding different disciplinary practices. Additionally, ISB, or the Illinois State Board of Education, their website offers a guide for parents surrounding special education rights, which include disciplinary practices. And then finally, as we talked about a few slides ago, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights features that request for information regarding the non-discriminatory administration of school discipline. If you honestly just Google Department of Education OCR, you'll be able to access that report. And then we want to continue to monitor it to see how the U.S. Department responds to the public comments that were due on July 23rd. So a lot of the information came from these sources, ISB, Education Week, Equip for Equality, and then a couple of U.S. News articles. So if you have any questions following this presentation, please feel free to call the Moran Center and ask to speak with someone on the Education Advocacy team. Again, my name is Brittany Harris. I am a law clerk with the Education Advocacy Program. Phone number is provided here. And I thank you very much for attending and watching this brief presentation. And please feel free to reach out with any questions and have a wonderful start to this school year. Thank you.